Welcome back to the deep dive and to our segment, Reformed Thinking.
It's good to be here.
Today, we are opening up a really structural view of Christian history. We're going to be looking at a massive theological framework from Jonathan Edwards.
Right.
We're using excerpts from his big work, A History of the Work of Redemption, and we're really zeroing in on how he understood the time that we're in right now.
That long stretch of time.
Yeah, that huge period from Christ's resurrection all the way until his final return.
And that's the key, isn't it? Edwards was so dedicated to finding the divine logic in human history. So our mission today is really to analyze his specific periodization of church history.
Okay.
It's a framework that just doesn't allow for historical randomness. He looks at this huge 2 millennia span not as a bunch of disconnected events, but as a specific intentional period in God's plan.
And he gives this period a very stark title, a very purposeful one, the appointed day of Zion's troubles. So this isn't just a time that has trouble in it. It's a time that is defined by affliction, by persecution, and by the true body of believers being constantly, oppressed and kept under by their enemies.
It really forces you to rethink some of our maybe more comfortable assumptions about how history is supposed to progress after Christ's victory.
I agree.
I mean, Edwards puts suffering right at the center of the post-resurrection experience. He sees it as a necessary, sovereignly ordered state that has to run its course before the promised era of rest and glory can even begin.
So if we can get a handle on this framework, we can better understand the kind of theological comfort Edwards was offering to a suffering church, whether that's in his day or, frankly, in ours.
Yes.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of an appointed day. When Edwards uses that word appointed, it suggests, it has clear boundaries. Where does he say this long period of affliction starts, and what's the finish line?
He sets the boundaries with total precision, and they're sweeping. The period of suffering begins, and this is the paradox, with Christ's resurrection.
Right at the moment of victory.
Right. The very moment that Christ triumphs over death and sin and the grave, that same moment kicks off the beginning of the church's greatest physical and visible trials on earth.
It's almost as if the victory provoked the enemy into a more intense war.
That's a good way to put it.
Oh.
A war against the victorious king's subjects.
And that appointed day only ends with one single huge event.
The fall of Antichrist. The decisive destruction of Antichrist.
Which means that from his perspective, and certainly from where we're sitting now, this period of troubles covers almost the entire history of the visible church.
It does. And the nature of this suffering state is what makes it so defining for him. It's not, occasional, it's continuous.
Okay.
Edwards does grant that there might be regional breaks or maybe temporal lulls in the fighting, but his reading of prophetic history demands that the persecution is continuous.
So how does he qualify that? He clarifies it by saying either some part or other of the church is suffering, or for the great part of the time, the whole church, or at least the generality of God's people, have been systematically persecuted.
That distinction is so important. It means that even if, say, the Reformed churches in his own New England were enjoying relative peace, the true body of Christ, when you look at it globally or historically, was still going through this appointed affliction. The shadow of oppression is always there, somewhere.
It's the default status. For Edwards, the church is currently wrestling, not reigning. And this view prevents any one generation from getting too comfortable or complacent just because they happen to be in a politically safe spot.
So the historical status of the true faith, as he stresses, is to be kept under by enemies until that one event.
Until the fall of Antichrist, that single event is the pivot point for all of the subsequent history.
So if the destruction of Antichrist is the end of the troubles, that event must kick off an era of, incredible glory. What hope does he attach to that guaranteed endpoint? He says the fall of Antichrist marks the arrival of the appointed day of the church's prosperity on earth.
Okay, another appointed day.
Yes. This is where the divine appointment shifts from suffering to favor. He uses that powerful biblical phrase. This is the set time in which God will favor Zion.
So the affliction is timed, and the prosperity is also timed. It's a transition from one divinely determined phase to the next. What does this prosperity actually look like for the saints?
Well, it involves a literal, visible shift in historical authority. The saints will move from being oppressed and marginalized by wicked men to a position where they shall reign.
That's the destination.
That's the ultimate guaranteed historical destination on earth.
And he's not just speculating here. He backs us up with what is probably the clearest prophetic promise about the church's earthly future, which is Daniel 7:27.
Yes, precisely. And the kingdom shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Edwards uses this text to establish the church's final destiny on earth. So that entire long, agonizing period of affliction, Zion's troubles, it's just the necessary historical mechanism that leads directly to this earthly kingdom, where the righteous authority of God's people is visibly established.
It's a really powerful way to frame history because it takes all these events that seem random, wars, plagues, martyrdoms, and it gives them a crucial active function in God's story.
It does. Every moment of historical suffering is given weight because it's leading directly to that promised reign of the saints.
And it forces you, the listener, to view all political and social history through a very specific lens.
A very specific lens. The status and the treatment of the true body of believers. If they are suffering, then God's historical clock is running exactly as it should be, working toward that glorious end.
Given that this era spans, nearly 2,000 years, it makes sense that Edwards would break this appointed day of trouble into different historical phases.
Yes, he does.
So let's start at the beginning, the early phase of suffering right after the resurrection. What defined those first 300 years?
That period, the first 3 centuries, was defined almost entirely by just immense external persecution. It's the classic era of the martyrs.
Right.
Edwards calls this phase, for the most part, in a state of great affliction. The church was, in his words, the object of reproach and persecution from 2 big external sources.
The first source of that trouble came from, ironically, those who should have recognized Christ, the Jews.
That was the initial, most immediate opposition. The Jews, as the former people of God, rejected their Messiah, and so they became the first organized persecutors of the new church.
And
then, once the church broke out of Jerusalem and started to spread through the Roman Empire, the main instrument of persecution shifted from the synagogue to the state. The hostility moved from a religious difference to imperial violence.
And that, of course, brings in the heavy hand of the pagan Roman state, the Rome of Nero, Diocletian, all the great waves of imperial persecution, what we often call the 10 persecutions.
It was persecution by the sword. It was designed to physically extinguish the church, and this set the initial pattern of affliction. The church is born and immediately faces these systematic attempts at destruction from the dominant powers.
And that pattern continues right up until the big turning point, Constantine's conversion.
Correct.
Historically, Constantine's time, starting around 312 AD, is seen as this huge watershed moment. Christianity becomes legal, then the favored state religion. It's often celebrated as the end of the early troubles. But Edwards sees this moment with a lot of theological caution, doesn't he?
He does.
He sees it as just a brief interlude, not a permanent victory.
He absolutely downplays its significance for the overall framework of troubles. He acknowledges that the church did enjoy rest and prosperity for a little while under Constantine, but he immediately grounds this rest in prophetic scripture, specifically in Revelation chapter 7, to stop anyone from thinking the appointed time of trouble was over.
So how does he connect Constantine's political piece to the imagery in Revelation?
Well, Edwards interprets that vision of the angel holding the 4 winds for a little while as the exact divine blueprint for the Constantinian peace.
The 4 winds being forces of judgment.
Yes, forces of judgment or historical upheaval. So when the angel holds them, it's a momentary pause, a brief, scheduled intermission in the continuous struggle.
So that this viewpoint insists that the rest was temporary, it was fragile, and it was still placed within the larger story of the struggle.
Right. It prevents the church from confusing a political ceasefire with the fulfillment of God's ultimate promise of prosperity.
That really reframes the whole historical event. It suggests that even this great historical victory was just a necessary short breath before the next and maybe more insidious wave of trouble.
It was.
So what was the first trouble that came back so quickly after this intermission?
The rest was very fleeting. Edwards observes that the church, presently after this brief period of external prosperity, suffered again, but the source of the affliction changed dramatically.
How so?
It moved from an external political force to an internal theological corruption. The Arian persecution.
And this is a really important distinction. We've moved from persecution by pagan emperors to persecution driven by heresy. We should probably pause here for a moment and clarify for you listening. What was Arianism, and how did a doctrinal disagreement become a form of persecution?
Well, Arianism was the major theological war of the 4th century. It was led by Arius, who denied the full eternal divinity of Christ.
Okay.
He argued that the Son was created by the Father, which basically makes Christ a lesser deity. For Edwards and for Orthodox Christians holding to the Nicene Creed, this was an attack on the very heart of the gospel, a foundational lie.
But how does that become persecution in Edwards' understanding of Zion's troubles?
It becomes persecution because the Arian faction often gained political power, especially through key emperors and bishops. And once they were in power, they used the instruments of both the church and the state councils, excommunication, imperial decrees, and yes, even exile and physical violence, to silence and punish those who held to the Orthodox view, like Athanasius.
So the sword was now being wielded not by pagans, but by professing Christians defending what he saw as a damning false doctrine.
Exactly. The target was no longer just the believer's body, but the purity of the belief itself.
So the oppression continues, but it just changes its nature. The true faith is now kept under by spiritual error that's cloaked in institutional power.
And this internal struggle is what set the stage for the rise of the primary long-term source of suffering, which is the rise of Antichrist.
Right.
So following the instability of those Arian conflicts and the growing corruption in the church hierarchy, the system of Antichrist rose to dominance. And this is where Edwards moves into that long era we call the Middle Ages. At this point, the true church, the faithful remnant, was effectively driven away into the wilderness.
That phrase, driven into the wilderness, is powerful. It suggests a time of spiritual invisibility, doesn't it?
It does. It comes right out of Revelation 12, describing the woman who is the true church fleeing into obscurity to be protected.
I see.
So the true body of believers was kept down in obscurity, contempt, and suffering for 1,000 years or more. They were small, scattered groups, the Waldenses, the Lollards, people like that, marginalized and oppressed by the very institution that was claiming to be the Catholic Church.
There's a key theological insight here, which is that the suffering state actually guaranteed the holiness of that remnant. Why did Edwards see that obscurity as being protective of holiness?
Because staying in the visible, dominant institution of what he called anti-Christian Rome required compromise. It required corruption of doctrine and practice.
Okay.
So by being driven into the wilderness, by refusing to participate in the political power, the idolatry, the theological errors of the dominant system, the remnant was preserved in its purity. The fire of persecution, while it was painful, it burned away all the dross, and it ensured that only true, sincere faith survived outside that corrupt, visible structure.
So suffering became a guarantee of authentic faith.
In a way, yes.
And this obscurity and oppression continued right up until the Reformation in the 16th century. Luther and Calvin arrive, the true gospel is preached openly again, and the light finally shines brightly across Europe. Surely that ends the appointed day of great affliction.
That is the assumption that a lot of modern historians would make, but Edwards disagrees forcefully. He makes one of his most striking historical observations here. He argues that even after the Reformation, the suffering did not stop. In fact, he says, the Church's persecutions since the Reformation have been beyond all that ever were before.
That seems very counterintuitive. How could post-Reformation persecution be worse than the Roman Colosseum or the medieval Inquisition?
Well, Edwards saw the immediate aftermath of the Reformation, which triggered the Counter-Reformation. And this wasn't just doctrinal debate. This was massive, organized, institutional violence.
You mean the wars of religion?
The wars of religion, exactly. Think about the scale of the 30 Years' War, the persecution of the Huguenots in France, the atrocities in the Netherlands, the constant threat that the Puritans and Covenanters faced. These were highly focused, religiously sanctioned massacres, often targeting huge, established populations of Protestants with a unified zeal you didn't even see under the pagan emperors.
So the revival of truth during the Reformation didn't stop Zion's troubles. It actually intensified them.
It did, because it provoked an immense, organized counter-reaction from the forces of anti-Christian Rome. The conflict became global, and the stakes, in Edwards' mind, were higher because the enemy was now fully developed as this spiritual Babylon.
So if we fast forward to his own time, the 18th century, he concludes that the basic condition of the true church is still unchanged.
Yes, he acknowledges that some parts of God's church might have had rest. He's probably thinking of geographically isolated or politically stable Protestant areas.
Sure.
But the true church, globally, is still very much kept under by its enemies, and some parts face grievous persecution. So his structural conclusion is clear. This overall condition of affliction has to continue until the final fall of Antichrist. The time is still appointed trouble.
Which brings us to the deeper meaning of all this suffering. If 2,000 years of affliction are necessary and appointed, they have to serve some kind of powerful theological function. What imagery does Edwards use to explain the purpose of this suffering state?
He uses the very intense and I think hopeful metaphor of the church's travail or labor.
Like childbirth.
Exactly like childbirth. And that instantly shifts the purpose of the pain. It's not senseless suffering. It's pain that's directed toward bringing about a glorious birth. The affliction now is just a necessary means to an end.
And this metaphor is very deeply rooted in Scripture, especially in connecting the present pain to the ultimate glory. What passages does he point to?
Well, he uses John 16:20-21, where Christ comforts his disciples by comparing their sorrow to a woman in labor. Intense grief is followed by intense joy, and the pain is forgotten the moment the child is born. But even more central for him is the imagery in Revelation 12:1-2.
The woman clothed with the Son who is crying out in birth pangs to bring forth.
Right. So Edwards synthesizes these. The church, the true body of believers, is striving to bring forth that glory and prosperity that will follow the destruction of Antichrist. The suffering of this age is the birth pangs. The great millennial prosperity is the child.
And that perspective makes every moment of affliction meaningful. It's driving the church toward its guaranteed future.
It is.
That helps focus on the endurance that's required. The travail is intense, but the metaphor also guarantees the outcome birth always follows labor. So this long time of trouble has to be temporary.
And that's where you get the clash between human perception and divine perception. Edwards knows that this is a long time of the church's trouble and affliction when we look at it from our short lifespans. But when you measure it against the scope of the church's eternal prosperity that follows, he calls it only for a little season.
That shift in scale is so important for those who are actually enduring persecution. What feels like an endless, unjust oppression to one generation is just a footnote in the grand timeline of the redeemed.
It gives perspective, and it connects directly to the cries of those who have suffered martyrdom all throughout history. Edwards points to Revelation 6:10, where the souls of the martyrs, seen under the altar, are crying out under the long continuance of this affliction. They are demanding accountability.
Their question just perfectly captures the tension of waiting for justice. How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?
That is the pivotal question of Zion's troubles. They see the injustice, they experience the violence, and they perceive the divine plan as being, well, agonizingly delayed. They aren't questioning God's ability, but his timing.
And the response they get is what defines Edwards' whole understanding of how long this period has to be.
It does. They receive white robes, which symbolize righteousness and purity, but they're also given a time frame for the rest they have to observe.
They're told to rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also, and their brethren that should be killed as they were, should be fulfilled.
And that phrase is the core theological justification for the long duration. It's a little season in divine time, but it's necessary to fulfill the full appointed number of martyrs and witnesses.
So the period of trouble can't end until the full number of those appointed to bear witness through suffering is complete.
The purpose of the struggle hasn't been exhausted yet, and Edwards reinforces the continuity of this suffering question by drawing a parallel all the way back to the Old Testament.
Right. He shows that the question of duration is not unique to the New Testament church.
No, not at all. He references Daniel 12:6, where the prophet asks, "How long shall it be to the end of these wonders?" This recurrence shows that the oppression and the theological anxiety over how long it will last are constant features for God's people during times of tribulation.
And this sense of waiting, of resting for a little season, is a specific call to historical patience, to trust that God's clock, not ours, is the one that matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It means that to be a true saint in this era is to accept the discomfort and the apparent delay, trusting that the travail is working toward a definite, glorious, and by divine standards, imminent outcome.
We've established the time frame and the theological meaning of the suffering, which is the travail. Now we have to identify the instrument of that suffering. For Edwards, there is one constant primary antagonist that spans this entire period of Zion's troubles.
He is incredibly clear on this. Edwards asserts that the main instrument of the church's sufferings, from the days of the apostles right through to his own day in the 18th century, has been the Roman government in its various forms.
Calling it the Roman government is key because that allows him to span the gap between the pagan emperors who burned Christians and the ecclesiastical power that issued inquisitorial decrees. How does he bridge that huge historical and spiritual difference?
He bridges it through prophetic type and antitype. Edwards explains that this is precisely why Rome is called Babylon in the New Testament.
Okay.
This typological identification links the suffering of the Christian church directly to the great prophetic narrative concerning ancient Israel.
So Rome is the spiritual Babylon, which oppresses the spiritual Jerusalem, which is the Christian church.
That's the analogy. Edwards draws the direct parallel. The troubles of ancient Jerusalem came mainly from the hostile city of Babylon that led them into captivity. Therefore, the troubles of the Christian church must come mainly from Rome during its long tribulation.
The historical antagonism and the role of the oppressor stay consistent.
They stay consistent. Only the manifestation of the city changes from literal Babylon to spiritual Rome.
And this typology justifies the coded language that's used in Revelation, which would have been crucial for early believers who were facing immediate persecution from the state.
It provided both warning and comfort. It identified the oppressive power in a way that was immediately recognizable to those who were steeped in Old Testament prophecy. It grounded their contemporary suffering in the deep, predictable history of God's dealings.
Edwards, though, is careful to differentiate between the two major historical phases of Roman oppression that we've touched on.
He makes a very clear historical breakpoint. The first phase, before Constantine and the official acceptance of Christianity, came from heathen Rome. This was the Rome of overt pagan worship, the political state using the sword against a foreign religion. The oppression was external and undeniable.
But the second phase, after the Christianization of the empire, is much longer and represents the true rise of the anti-Christian power.
Yes. Since Constantine, the troubles have shifted, and they've come mainly from anti-Christian Rome, which Edwards, following the Protestant reformers, identifies explicitly as the institutionalized Church of Rome, and particularly the papacy.
So the system of persecution morphed from external political violence to internal, institutional, and spiritual corruption that was wielding political power.
That's right.
Now, this is a massive claim, and it's essential for us to present Edwards' theological framework clearly without endorsing the claim itself. For Edwards, what made this power anti-Christian in its nature?
For him and for the Reformed tradition he represented, anti-Christian Rome was defined by its corruption of Christ's offices.
Okay.
It claimed a spiritual authority that belonged only to Christ as the head of the church, a priestly power that usurped Christ's mediation, and a political sovereignty over nations. So the oppression was twofold. First, by propagating false doctrine that damns souls, and second, by physically persecuting the remnant who held to the pure gospel.
So it was the continuation of Babylonian captivity, just enforced by a corrupt church hierarchy instead of a pagan king.
That's how he saw it. The spiritual Babylon is embodied first by the pagan empire, and then by this corrupted spiritual empire. Rome is the constant antagonist, the necessary tool used to keep Zion under affliction until the set time is fulfilled.
And this framework is so essential because it guarantees the final conclusion, connecting it right back to the original analogy. The time of the Jewish literal captivity in the Old Testament ended with the decisive historical destruction of Babylon.
And the spiritual captivity and trouble of the Christian church will follow that exact historical and prophetic pattern.
Right.
Edwards concludes this segment with the ultimate promise, one that guarantees the end of Zion's troubles. He says the time of the Christian church's affliction will cease with the destruction of the Church of Rome, that spiritual Babylon.
So the destruction of the main instrument of oppression, the Antichrist, is the required final act before the saints are brought forth from their long travail into their promised reign.
Yes, that's the end of the story of suffering.
We've seen how Edwards constructs a view of history that imposes this rigorous divine order onto centuries of struggle. It's a long-appointed path of affliction, but it's one that is structured entirely toward the guaranteed arrival of the saints' prosperity and reign.
What stands out to me is how this framework gives meaning to every moment of martyrdom and persecution. Nothing is arbitrary. Everything is serving the purpose of fulfilling the necessary travail before that glorious birth.
And the insight for us as learners is recognizing that Edwards' view of history provides this comprehensive theological framework that gives purpose to affliction by making it temporary, necessary, and preceding a definitive, guaranteed triumph.
And if we go back to that instruction given to the persecuted saints in Revelation 6, the command for them to rest yet for a little season, it raises a crucial thought for you to carry forward. Edwards saw this rest not as passive waiting, but as active endurance that's rooted in a divine calendar. So if centuries of waiting are just a little season leading up to the kingdom, What practical historical patience is Edwards asking us to adopt in our present era, especially when we face our own smaller, localized versions of Zion's troubles?
That is a very searching question. It changes the nature of endurance from just a passive resignation to a hopeful, active participation in a necessary prelude to the kingdom.
I think so.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical theology of Jonathan Edwards. Until next time, keep thinking.